It was one of those days that started like any other, but ended up changing everything for him. He woke up early, the kind of early where the sun hadn't even thought about rising yet, and the streets were still quiet, except for the occasional car passing by. He was living in his car at the time, parked in a spot near the park where he wouldn't get hassled too much. The cold was biting, even with the blanket he'd managed to hold on to, and he just sat there for a while staring at the steering wheel, wondering how he'd ended up like this. It wasn't supposed to be his life, you know? He used to have a family, a home, a job, things that felt solid like they'd never go away. But after the accident, everything just slipped through his fingers. He couldn't remember much about who he was before, just bits and pieces that didn't make sense. The only thing that stayed with him was this melody, a lullaby he'd hum to himself when things got really bad. He didn't know where it came from, but it felt like the only thing that was truly his. That morning, like most mornings, he got out of the car and stretched, his breath visible in the cold air. He grabbed his old guitar, the one he'd found in a dumpster a few months back, and started walking toward the park. Playing music was the only thing that made him feel alive anymore. It wasn't about the money people tossed into his case. It was about the way the notes seemed to fill the empty spaces inside him. He didn't know why, but that lullaby always came out when he played, like his fingers remembered even if his mind didn't. He sat down on his usual bench, the one near the fountain, and started playing. The park was still mostly empty, just a few joggers and dog walkers, but he didn't care. He closed his eyes and let the music take over, like it always did, and that's when it happened, the moment that would change everything. A man stopped to listen, really listen, not just toss a coin and walk away. He stood there for a while, just watching, and when the song ended, he approached. "That melody," the man said, his voice quiet but intense. "Where did you learn it?" He didn't know how to answer. He just shrugged and said it was something he'd always known. The man nodded like he understood something no one else did, and then he said the words that would turn his world upside down. "I think I know who you are." The man introduced himself as Eric, and there was something about the way he spoke, calm but urgent, like he was holding back a flood of emotions. He explained that he was getting married soon and that the band he'd hired for the wedding had canceled at the last minute. "I heard you playing," Eric said, "and I think you'd be perfect. Would you consider playing at the wedding?" He hesitated. Playing in front of a crowd at a wedding, no less, felt like a huge leap from his usual park bench performances. But something about Eric's sincerity made him nod. "Sure," he said, though he wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the way Eric looked at him, like he saw something in him that no one else had noticed in years. Eric handed him a card with the address and time, and just like that, he had a gig. For the rest of the day, he couldn't stop thinking about it. He practiced the lullaby over and over, the melody feeling more familiar and comforting with each repetition. But there was also a strange unease, like the song was trying to tell him something he couldn't quite grasp. That night, as he lay in his car staring at the ceiling, he wondered if this was a mistake. What if he messed up? What if people laughed at him? But deep down there was a flicker of hope, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe, just maybe, this was the break he'd been waiting for. The next morning he woke up early again, but this time, it wasn't just another day. He cleaned himself up as best as he could, using the public restroom at the park to wash his face and comb his hair. He even put on the least wrinkled shirt he had, trying to look presentable. As he drove to the venue, his hands were shaking on the wheel. He hadn't been in a place like this in years. Somewhere nice, somewhere where people gathered to celebrate. When he arrived, the place was already buzzing with activity. People were setting up decorations, arranging flowers, and testing the sound system. Eric spotted him right away and waved him over. "You made it," he said, smiling. "I'm so glad you came." He nodded, feeling out of place but also strangely welcomed. Eric showed him where he'd be playing and introduced him to a few people, but he barely registered their names. His mind was too focused on the task ahead. When it was time to play, he took a deep breath and stepped up to the microphone. The room fell silent, and he began to play the lullaby. As the first notes filled the air, something inside him shifted. It was like the music was unlocking a door he didn't even know was closed. As he played, he noticed a woman in the front row, her eyes wide, her hands trembling as she clutched a tissue. She looked like she'd seen a ghost. He didn't know why, but his gaze kept drifting back to her, and the more he played, the more her expression changed. By the time he finished the song, she was crying, but not in a sad way. It was like she was crying from relief, from something she'd been waiting for forever. The room erupted in applause, but he barely heard it. All he could focus on was the woman who was now walking toward him. "That song," she said, her voice breaking. "Where did you learn it?" He didn't know how to answer. He just shrugged and said it was something he'd always known. She stared at him for a moment like she was trying to see past the beard and the worn-out clothes, and then she said the words that would change everything. "That's the lullaby my father wrote for me. He disappeared years ago after the accident. I thought he was gone forever." His heart stopped. The room seemed to spin as he looked at her, really looked at her, and suddenly, pieces of his past started falling into place. Her face, her voice. They were familiar in a way he couldn't explain. "Amara," he whispered, the name slipping out before he even realized he knew it. Her eyes filled with tears again, and she nodded. "Dad?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper, and just like that, the walls he'd built around himself came crashing down. He didn't know how or why, but he knew she was telling the truth. This was his daughter. This was his Amara. He reached out, his hand shaking, and she took it, her grip tight like she was afraid he'd disappear again. The room around them faded into the background as they stood there, holding on to each other like they were the only two people in the world. He didn't know what to say, so he just held her, feeling the weight of all those lost years pressing down on him. But there was also a sense of relief, like a part of him that had been missing for so long had finally been found. Eric came over then, his face a mix of shock and understanding. "I had no idea," he said, looking between the two of them. I thought you'd be perfect for the wedding. I didn't know." His voice trailed off, and he shook his head like he couldn't believe what was happening. Neither could he. It felt like a dream, like any moment he'd wake up back in his car, alone and forgotten. But Amara's hand in his was real, and so was the look in her eyes, a look that said she'd never let him go again. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Amara introduced him to her mother, Lena, who looked at him with a mix of shock and relief. She didn't say much at first, just hugged him tightly, like she was afraid he'd vanish if she let go. The wedding went on, but it felt different now, like the celebration wasn't just for Eric and Amara, but for him too, for the family that had been broken and was now coming back together. He played more songs, but they were all for Amara, each note a piece of the love he'd carried with him, even when he didn't know who he was. People came up to him afterward, shaking his hand and saying how beautiful the music was, but he barely registered their words. All he could think about was Amara and Lena, and the life they'd had before the accident. He didn't remember everything, not yet. But the pieces were starting to come back, like a puzzle slowly coming together. That night after the wedding, they sat together in a quiet corner of the venue, talking for hours. Amara told him about her life, about how she'd never stopped hoping he'd come back. Lena filled in the gaps, telling him about the years they'd spent searching for him, the nights they'd cried themselves to sleep. He listened, his heart breaking and healing all at once. It was overwhelming, but it was also the most real thing he'd felt in years. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he belonged somewhere, like he was home. As they talked, more memories started to surface. Little things at first, like the way Lena used to hum while she cooked, or the way Amara would laugh when he played silly songs on the guitar. But there were also harder memories, like the accident itself. He didn't remember much about that day, just flashes of noise and pain, but he knew it had changed everything. He didn't want to dwell on it, though. Not tonight. Tonight was about being together, about starting to rebuild what had been lost. When it was time to leave, Amara and Lena insisted he come home with them. He hesitated, feeling like he didn't deserve it, but they wouldn't take no for an answer. "Your family," Amara said, her voice firm. and family sticks together. So he went with them, leaving his old life behind without a second thought. As he sat in the back seat of their car, watching the city lights pass by, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. It wasn't perfect, there was still a lot to figure out. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had a future. And that was enough. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of emotions and adjustments. Living with Amara and Lena was both comforting and strange. He wasn't used to having a roof over his head, let alone people who cared about him. Every morning he'd wake up and for a moment he'd think it was all a dream. But then he'd hear Amara's voice or smell the coffee Lena was brewing, and it would hit him all over again. This was real. He started seeing a therapist to help with his memory and the trauma of the accident, and slowly but surely, more pieces of his past came back. Some of it was painful, like remembering the fear and confusion after the accident. But other memories were like gifts, like the first time he held Amara as a baby, or the way Lena used to dance with him in the kitchen. He started playing music again, not just for himself but for others too. Amara suggested they open a community center where he could teach music to people who were struggling, just like he had been. It felt like a way to give back, to turn everything he'd been through into something good. They found a small building in the neighborhood and started fixing it up, with help from Eric and some of their friends. It wasn't easy. There were days when he felt overwhelmed, like he wasn't ready for any of this. But Amara and Lena were always there, reminding him that he wasn't alone anymore. And that made all the difference. The center became a labor of love for all of them. Amara handled the logistics, Lena organized fundraising events, and he focused on the music. They started small, offering free lessons to kids in the neighborhood, but word spread quickly. Soon they had people of all ages coming in, some to learn music, others just to have a safe place to be. He found himself connecting with people in ways he never expected, especially those who were struggling with their own battles. It was like the music gave them a way to express what they couldn't put into words, just like it had for him. One day, as he was teaching a group of kids how to play the guitar, he looked up and saw Amara watching from the doorway. She had tears in her eyes, but she was smiling. "You're amazing, Dad," she said later when they had a moment alone. "I always knew you would be." Her words stayed with him, a reminder of how far he'd come and how much he still had to give. It wasn't always easy. There were still days when the past felt heavy, when he doubted himself. But he was learning to take it one step at a time. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. As the months went by, the community center became a cornerstone of the neighborhood. People started calling it the Lullaby Center, named after the song that had brought him and Amara back together. It was a place where anyone could come to find solace, to learn, or just to feel like they belonged. He spent most of his days there teaching music, listening to people's stories, and sometimes just sitting quietly with someone who needed company. It wasn't just about the music anymore, it was about connection, about showing people that they mattered. One day, a young man came in, looking lost and unsure. He reminded him so much of himself back when he was living in his car that it almost hurt to look at him. The young man said he'd heard about the center from a friend and wanted to learn how to play the guitar. He didn't have much, just an old, beat-up instrument he'd found at a thrift store, but he was eager to learn. As they sat together going over the basics, he saw something in the young man's eyes that he recognized: hope. It was fragile, just a flicker, but it was there. And he knew, in that moment, that this was what it was all about. Not just helping people, but showing them that they could help themselves, that they could find their way back, just like he had. The young man, whose name was Marcus, started coming to the center regularly. He wasn't just learning music, he was finding a sense of purpose. Over time, Marcus opened up about his struggles, how he'd lost his job, how he'd been living on the streets, how he felt like he'd hit rock bottom. Listening to him felt like looking in a mirror, and it made him even more determined to help. He started giving Marcus small tasks around the center, like setting up chairs or helping with the younger kids, It wasn't much, but it gave Marcus a sense of responsibility, something to be proud of. One day, Marcus brought in a song he'd written. It was raw and a little rough around the edges, but it was honest. As Marcus played it, he felt a lump in his throat. The song was about loss and hope, about finding light in the darkest places. When Marcus finished, the room was silent for a moment, and then everyone started clapping. Marcus looked stunned, like he couldn't believe people were cheering for him. But he knew exactly how Marcus felt. He'd been there too. That moment, seeing Marcus's face light up with pride, was one of the most rewarding things he'd ever experienced. It was a reminder that the center wasn't just changing lives, it was saving them, and in doing so, it was saving him too. The center grew, and so did the community around it. People who had once been strangers became friends, bound together by their shared love of music and their desire to help one another. He started hosting open mic nights, where anyone could come and perform, no matter their skill level. It wasn't about being perfect, it was about being brave enough to share a piece of yourself. Those nights became some of the most special moments at the center. He'd sit in the back watching as people took the stage, their faces lighting up as they sang or played. Some were nervous at first, their hands shaking as they held the microphone, but by the end of their performance, they were beaming. It was like they discovered something inside themselves they didn't know was there, and he understood that feeling all too well. One night, Amara convinced him to perform. He hadn't played in front of a crowd since the wedding, and the thought made him nervous. But she wouldn't take no for an answer. "You started all of this," she said. "People need to see you up there." So he did it. He played the lullaby, the one that had brought him back to her, and as he looked out at the crowd, he saw faces he recognized. Marcus, Lena, Eric, and so many others who had become like family. When he finished, the room erupted in applause, but all he could see was Amara, smiling at him with tears in her eyes. In that moment, he felt like he'd come full circle. The music that had saved him was now saving others, and he couldn't have asked for anything more. The open mic nights became a tradition, a way for people to come together and celebrate each other. He loved seeing the way music brought people out of their shells, how it gave them a voice when they felt like they had none. One night, a woman named Sarah took the stage. She was shy at first, barely speaking above a whisper as she introduced herself. But when she started singing, the room fell silent. Her voice was hauntingly beautiful, filled with pain and hope all at once. After her performance, she came up to him and thanked him for creating a space where she felt safe enough to share her story. "I haven't sung in years," she said, "but being here, it made me feel like I could again." Her words stayed with him, a reminder of why the center mattered. It wasn't just about music. It was about giving people a chance to heal, to be seen, to be heard. And as he looked around the room that night, at all the faces smiling and laughing, he knew he'd found his purpose. This was where he was meant to be. As the years passed, the center became more than just a place. It became a movement. People from other neighborhoods started coming, and soon they were talking about opening more centers in different parts of the city. He never imagined it would grow like this, but he was proud of what they'd built. Amara and Lena were right there with him, helping to manage the expansion and making sure the original center stayed true to its roots. It wasn't always easy. There were challenges and setbacks, but they faced them together, as a family. One of the most rewarding parts was seeing the people who had come through the center go on to do amazing things. Marcus, for example, started his own music program for at-risk youth, inspired by the time he'd spent at the center. Sarah became a regular performer at local venues, her confidence growing with each show. And then there were the kids, so many kids who found a safe haven at the center, a place where they could be themselves and dream big. He loved watching them grow, their faces lighting up as they mastered a new song or performed for the first time. It was like seeing pieces of himself in each of them, reminders of how far he'd come and how much he still had to give. The center wasn't just changing lives, it was creating a legacy, one that would continue long after he was gone. And that, more than anything, gave him a sense of peace. One day, as he was teaching a group of kids how to play the drums, he noticed a little girl sitting in the corner, watching intently but too shy to join in. He walked over and knelt down beside her. "Do you want to try?" he asked, holding out a pair of drumsticks. She hesitated, then nodded. As she started tapping on the drums, her face lit up with a smile so bright it could have powered the whole room. Her name was Mia, and she became a regular at the center, her confidence growing with each visit. Watching her, he felt a surge of pride, not just for her but for everything the center represented. It was a place where people could find themselves, where they could discover their own rhythm and learn to dance to it. And as he looked around the room that day, at all the faces, young and old, shy and bold, he knew he'd found his purpose. This was where he was meant to be, doing what he was meant to do. And he wouldn't have traded it for anything in the world. Over time, the center became a second home, not just for the community, but for him too. It was where he felt most alive, most connected to the world around him. He still had moments when the past felt heavy, when the memories of the accident or the years he'd lost would creep in. But they didn't define him anymore. He'd learned to carry them, not as a burden, but as a reminder of how far he'd come, and he wasn't alone in that journey. Amara and Lena were always there, their love and support unwavering. Eric, too, had become like a son to him, always ready to lend a hand or share a laugh. Together, they'd built something beautiful, something that would outlast them all. But it wasn't just about the center or the music. It was about the people, the ones who walked through the doors scared and unsure and left with a little more hope, a little more light. He saw it in their eyes, in the way they carried themselves, and it filled him with a sense of purpose he'd never known before. This was his life now, and it was more than he ever could have imagined. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that was enough. One evening, as he was closing up the center, he noticed a man sitting on the steps outside. He looked tired, his clothes worn and his face shadowed with worry. He approached him cautiously, not wanting to scare him off. "Hey," he said softly. "You okay?" The man looked up, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and hope. "I heard this is a place where people can start over," he said. "Is that true?" He nodded, his heart aching at the familiarity in the man's voice. "It is," he said. "Come on in. Let's talk." As they sat together in the quiet of the center, he listened to the man's story. How he'd lost his job, how he'd been living in his car, how he felt like he'd hit rock bottom. It was a story he knew all too well, and it reminded him why the center mattered. It wasn't just a place, it was a lifeline, a chance for people to find their way back. By the time they finished talking, the man looked a little lighter, like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. "Thank you," he said, his voice cracking. "I didn't know where else to go." He smiled, feeling a surge of gratitude for the life he'd been given and the chance to pay it forward. "You're in the right place," he said. "Welcome home." Years later, as he stood on the stage of the center during its 10th anniversary celebration, he looked out at the crowd and felt a wave of emotion unlike anything he'd ever experienced. The room was packed with faces he knew and loved. Amara, Lena, Eric, Marcus, Sarah, Mia, and so many others who had become part of his extended family. They were all there, not just to celebrate the center, but to celebrate the lives that had been changed because of it. As he spoke, his voice trembled with gratitude. "This place," he said, "was built on a lullaby, a song that brought me back to my family, to myself, and to all of you. But it's not just my story anymore. It's ours. And it's not just about music. It's about hope, about second chances, about finding light in the darkest places." The room erupted in applause, but all he could see were the tears in Amara's eyes and the proud smile on Lena's face. In that moment, he realized that his journey, from the streets to this stage, wasn't just about survival. It was about transformation. He had not only found his way back to his family, he had created a new one, a community bound together by love, resilience, and the belief that no one is ever truly lost. As the night ended and the crowd began to disperse, he stayed behind, sitting alone in the quiet of the center. He ran his fingers over the strings of his guitar, the same one he'd found in a dumpster all those years ago, and smiled. Life had come full circle, and he was exactly where he was meant to be. He thought about all the people who had walked through the doors of the center over the years, the ones who had come in broken and left whole, the ones who had found their voice, their purpose, their place in the world. Each of them had a story, and each of those stories was a thread in the tapestry of the center's legacy. He thought about Marcus, who was now running his own program for at-risk youth, and Sarah, who had become a beloved performer in the city. He thought about Mia, the little girl who had been too shy to join in that first day but was now teaching younger kids how to play the drums. And he thought about Amara and Lena, the two women who had never given up on him, even when he had given up on himself. They were his heart, his reason for everything. As he sat there in the quiet, he felt a deep sense of peace. The center was more than just a building. It was a living, breathing testament to the power of hope and the resilience of the human spirit. And as long as it stood, he knew his story, and the stories of everyone who had been part of it, would live on. He picked up his guitar and began to play, the notes filling the empty room like a prayer. It was the lullaby, the one that had started it all. And as he played, he knew that no matter what the future held, he was home.